of our reconstruction. We're waiting to get everybody muted. Let me also welcome several new members. Our last class on the 13th. I'm glad you're joining. And let me remind everybody to please use the chat function. We are going to have at least two opportunities to respond, and I'd love to get your thoughts, questions. So please, again, use the chat. I saw there was a couple of chats already before we get started. I could not proceed today without a couple of quick comments on Juneteenth. I hope that everyone had a Juneteenth opportunity yesterday in some way, and we certainly did here in our home. There were a number of media pieces available. The National Museum, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture had a wonderful program, which may still be up. And so I'd encourage you to go there. I think Jim Stewart, our Minnesota ASALH president, sent out an information, and I believe I included that link in one of my emails. If you don't get it, can't get it, let me know. But it's worth spending some time understanding Juneteenth. I don't want to spend a lot of time because I've obviously got always more planned than I can get through. But I thought I would do two things. There is a New York Times piece written by Jamel Bowie yesterday or the day before, Why Juneteenth Matters. I'll include this in my follow-up email to you, but just let me read a couple of paragraphs to spark your interest. He begins by saying, neither Abraham Lincoln nor the Republican Party freed the slaves. They helped set freedom in motion and eventually codified it into law with the 13th Amendment, but they were not themselves responsible for the end of slavery. They were not the ones who brought about its final destruction. Who freed the slaves? The slaves freed the slaves. Now, if you had taken my slavery class, you would have heard me make that same argument over and over and over again. Bowie makes it here as he starts this piece. He concludes the piece, and again, I said I will include this in my email to you, with this statement. Juneteenth may mark just one moment in the struggle for emancipation, but the holiday gives us an occasion to reflect on the profound contributions of enslaved Black Americans to the cause of human freedom. It gives us another way to recognize the central place of slavery and its demise in our national story. And it gives us an opportunity to remember that American democracy has more authors than the shrewd lawyers and erudite farmer philosophers of the Revolution, that our experiment in liberty owes as much to the men and women who toiled in bondage as it does to anyone else in this nation's history. Again, a piece worth reading, and you know I'm a big fan of Jamel Bowie. The second comment I'd make, I had a marvelous question from one of my fraternity brothers who was really asking the question on behalf of a friend, challenging what this friend had been seeing and reading about Juneteenth. Apparently better educated than most Americans, this friend understood that the Juneteenth, the June 19th, 1865 event where the enslaved people in Galveston first learned of their freedom was the result of the enslavers in Texas consciously keeping them working, if I can say it in that way. Remember, as we've said, the war was fought in the South. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863, freed the slaves in the seceded states. Obviously, the enslavers were going to keep their enslaved people as far away from that emancipation as possible, keep them working. And that would certainly be true in Texas, which was at the outer edge, at the frontier of slavery, as Ira Berlin refers to it. So my friend's friend is correct. It wasn't a breakdown in communication or the wires got crossed. Enslaved people continued to work for an additional 2.5 years because the enslavers insisted upon it. So I promised to do some more research on that for my friend, and I'm going to do it, but I thought that was an interesting question. A couple of other questions. Someone had asked, did Lincoln want to send the freedmen back to Africa? I said last week that Lincoln was a proponent of colonization all throughout his presidency and before. Never an abolitionist, but someone who hated slavery, as we said. He also did not believe that the enmity, the hard feelings that most white Americans had against enslaved, freed people would make living together impossible. So yes, he was a supporter of colonization and would have obviously supported the expatriation back to Africa or the Caribbean or South America if he could have done it. Would Lincoln have supported reparations to the freedmen? I have, and my Lincoln knowledge is average at best. It may be a question worth researching. I just don't know. I said last week that after enslaved people in Washington, D.C. and in the territories were freed, there were reparations paid to the enslavers. I would guess Lincoln would not have supported reparations to the freedmen, but it's hard for us to say. The greatest opportunity would have been had he survived, had Johnson not become president, and Lincoln and the radical Republicans been able to put together a different kind of Reconstruction. We'll talk more about what went wrong with Johnson's plans today, but again, that's kind of my answer to those two questions. I hope that you all saw, if you haven't, you will see Bryan Stevenson's organization, the Equal Justice Initiative, the folks who are responsible for the two new museums in Montgomery. Our Minnesota ASALH chapter visited almost a year and a half ago now, the Lynching Museum, commonly referred to, and the memorial. This piece on Reconstruction is brand new, and I've ordered a copy. We'll send a link again in my follow-up to you all. It's several pages long, but it's as is true with all of the materials produced by EJI. It's wonderful. Their booklet on slavery and mass incarceration are really well worth owning. Last sort of opening comment, we have a sort of special announcement. We're going to have an extension of our 8-week series into a 9th week. August 1st, so when I'm finished at the end of July, Randall Morgan has agreed to do a presentation, as you see on the screen, Race, Science, and Medicine in the Reconstruction period. So I'm really excited about this. I'm thankful to Dr. Morgan for agreeing to do it, and we will not charge you anything more than we've charged you for the 8 sessions so far. But please watch. I'll get more information to you on that as we proceed. Okay, so quick summary. We've talked about Lincoln, his views of slavery, the enslaved, the war. I've got some other thoughts I'll share when we talk about his second inaugural address. I think it reveals more about this great president of ours, Abraham Lincoln, and his thinking about the 250 years of enslavement, and that's going to. We talked about Lincoln's tempered view. This was the reference in the video, the four-seller video where he and Thaddeus Stevens were going back and forth, and Stevens, of course, the most radical of the radicals, scared Lincoln, frankly, in what he was proposing that the Congress would push on the South. But that was Lincoln's view, was tempered. He was willing to bring the South, the southern states, back at a very minimal cost to them. We talked about the New York City draft riots, the 1863 slaughter of Black men, women, and children in New York City as a result of the backlash, frankly, to the war and the large immigrant population, A, being afraid their jobs were going to be lost, but B, blaming the Black New Yorkers for that reality. And again, we've talked lots about riots and massacres. This was a bad one. Today, we're going to talk a lot about the 13th Amendment, obviously, and we're going to get into these Reconstruction amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. I ended last week with this great photo, and it was really a tease. It's one of my favorites. It's pulled from the Facing Our Freedom and Ourselves, maybe in one of the two videos we see today. But this is the famous meeting in Savannah, Georgia, between General Sherman and the Secretary of State Stanton, and a group of Black Savannah, both freed and newly freed Black men, talking about what to do about the Negro. This is a question, a theme that will be played out throughout Reconstruction into Jim Crow. One might say we're still asking that question today, but this was an interesting meeting. It will lead, and frankly, the Black participants in the meeting were of one mind. There were two things that were necessary, and they made this very clear to Stanton and to Sherman. We need land, and we need to be left alone. You remember Chad Williams, the Brandeis professor in our video series, who talked about land and autonomy. Sherman asked, would integration, should we not work to bring this society together, the Black and the white, and the leader of the Black contingent said, that would be wonderful, but unrealistic. We understand the hard feelings, and frankly, we've got community building to do. And we would prefer to do that among ourselves, not worried about the violence and brutality that they certainly knew and would certainly experience over the next several generations. So very, very important meeting. This would lead to Sherman's Special Field Order 15. Du Bois, in his Black Reconstruction, addresses this in really powerful language. I'll try to perhaps excerpt and copy it to you. But he talks about the seizure of almost 600,000 acres of abandoned lands. We'll get to the Freedmen's Bureau, and keep in mind that the Bureau was called the Bureau of Freedmen, Refugees, and Abandoned Lands. There was no shortage of available lands on which freedmen, women, and children could have built lives. And Sherman recognized this. He took much of this land, which was located at that time in the Sea Islands off of Georgia and South Carolina, placed freed Black men and women on those lands, and was perhaps the best opportunity the administration had at that time, and I would argue that the country had, to really build a economic base under which to support Reconstruction. We'll see how that evolves and devolves in the hands of Andrew Johnson very shortly. Also keep in mind that this is 1863, I believe, and I'm looking for the date, but from the beginning of the war, so 1860, you have enslaved men, women, and children running away to the Union lines. We've said that over and over again. It took almost 2 years for the Lincoln administration, the War Department, to come up with a plan to address the needs of this growing population of runaway, formerly enslaved people. Almost immediately, from certainly 1862 on, not just on the Sea Islands, but really all over, wherever the North was in control of rebel territory, Black men, women, and children were setting up homesteads, farms, And this would last through much of Reconstruction until finally and utterly overturned by the Redeemer government. So this Sea Islands experiment is one example, but there were examples all over, certainly in the lower Mississippi Valley, where the North was in control very early on. You see this phenomenon of Black people owning land practically, but not legally. Okay. Let's look at the first of two of our film series. This one raises the questions that have to be answered in Reconstruction, and I would argue never effectively answered as you get to the end of Reconstruction and into the redemption period. And that's unfortunate, because had those questions been answered a different way, I would argue, see the next few generations very differently than we see them as historians today. So defining freedom.
David, do you want me to record this?
Yes. This one will work, Marianne.
Okay.
Yep, thank you. I eliminated the YouTube-based videos so we don't have that problem.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I'd be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
Historians are loath to make grand, sweeping claims about all of humanity. But if I would make one sweeping claim about human beings that transcends time and space and culture and country, it's that all of us want to be free, to have free will, to be able to try to determine your life on its own terms, to be able to live and love freely. And you see this over and over and over and over again in every human society, this desire to be free. And so that was certainly true of Black people in the United States who had been enslaved since before the country even came into existence, who never were able to enjoy the kinds of freedoms that supposedly animated the country from its very birth. That the birth of this freedom-loving nation was forged in the crucible of slavery and the enslavement of Black people. And so at the moment of emancipation, you have not just the 4 million people who were enslaved, but every single Black person in the United States understood that this moment of emancipation was a moment of liberation for all of them, and also a moment of redemption for the country.
Migrate, go home to my Lord and be free.
The word freedom is used so often in our culture and in our country, we sometimes forget what it means. But freedom meant something real to people who didn't have it. To enslaved Africans, they had what Robin Kelly called freedom dreams. They had a desire to go where they wanted to go, to get the fruits and benefits of their own work, to form their own families, to walk with dignity and breathe easily, to look somebody in the eye as an equal human being, and to have a share in making the world in which they lived. Up until 1863, for 4 million enslaved Africans to think that was folly, it was foolishness. Nobody thought that that would ever come about. At least whites didn't think it would ever come about. But blacks prepared for it. They planned for it. When one slave ran away, they could have just stayed away, but they then organized to bring their brothers and sisters out of bondage into freedom. Harriet Tubman ran away to freedom and went back 19 times to slave territory to be a conductor on what we called the Underground Railroad, which wasn't a railroad at all, but it was a network of carts and wagons that brought people to freedom. People who were free, blacks who were free, could have said, well, that's it, I have what I want. But they felt they had an obligation to bring other people to freedom as well. That's a sense of freedom is not just an individual's desire for rights and agency, but a whole people's ability to work together to enjoy the fruits and benefits of life on this earth.
The Emancipation Proclamation, issued on January 1st, 1863, declared free the slaves, not in the entire country, but in most of the Confederacy. The proclamation says, from now on, it will be part of the job of the Union Army to protect the freedom of these people who have been declared free. So to the goal of preserving the Union, the proclamation adds the emancipation of the slaves. And even though there are a lot of slaves exempted, everybody understood that if all those 3.2 million are freed, the slavery of the others is not going to last all that much longer.
And so when the emancipation came, 200,000 blacks ran away from slavery and joined the Union Army. And their guns tipped the balance of power in that fight. Another million stayed behind, and they stopped working. They sabotaged the Confederate economy because they wouldn't grow the crops that the Confederacy needed in order to support itself. But even more importantly, they flocked to wherever the Union Army was, and they started to work the land together, work it in little plots, share seeds, share tools, share technology, and to create a vision of freedom that wasn't just a dream in their minds anymore. It was something they went out and worked on and built every day.
One of the most remarkable moments of the Civil War occurred in January of '65 after William Sherman's triumphant march through the South in Savannah, Georgia. He meets with a group of freedmen along with Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Sherman and Stanton gather a group of representative men and have a conversation with them about what freedom means. What do they want from this war? And they very clearly say what the Civil War means to them, what the war is being fought about, but also what they would like in the aftermath of the war. Two very important things come out of that conversation. One is land. African-Americans aspired to be landowners, to have a stake in the land that they had toiled on for generations. So the expectation of land ownership was incredibly important in terms of what freedom meant. The second important aspect that comes out of that conversation is autonomy. Being left alone, having the right to be left alone.
Finally, in January 1865, the Congress ratifies the 13th Amendment, which irrevocably abolishes slavery throughout the entire nation. The 13th Amendment covers all the slaves, it covers all the states, and it says there can no longer be slavery in the United States. So it's the final act, so to speak, of this process of destroying the institution of slavery.
Obviously, this was something that African Americans had dreamed about, right? Had envisioned, had thought about every day of their lives. What that really meant when it happened, when it hit you, that you were now free, was a moment of revelation. Was a moment of introspection, but also a moment of tremendous possibility.
What happens as a result of this, some of it's really concrete, right? You can move, you can leave, you can find your family, you can get married, you can get a job, you can earn a wage, you can save some money, you can provide for your children, you can make ends meet, you can travel. You can do all sorts of things that you couldn't do in a system of slavery. But there's also a more existential way of experiencing freedom, which is just a sense that whatever burden is on you, on your soul, on your heart, on your head, has been lifted. And possibilities exist, opportunities exist that can be seized.
But the 13th Amendment does not define freedom at all. In fact, it doesn't use the word freedom. It simply says slavery may not exist in this country. But then it has a second clause which says Congress has the power to enforce this by appropriate legislation. So that raises the question, what is freedom anyway? What does it mean to be a free person? In what ways can Congress enforce this? And a major part of the debate over Reconstruction is what you might call a debate over the definition of freedom.
Surely African Americans aspired to be seen as full, equal citizens. Frederick Douglass, in a famous address he gave entitled "What the Black Man Wants," talked about the importance of getting the right to vote, of being seen as equal citizens, having the rights of equal citizens. And that was something that really spoke to what a revolutionary transformation in social relations and political relations Reconstruction was. The very idea of Black people as equal citizens ran completely against the history and legacy of white supremacy.
I always tell my students that the most important day of the revolution is the day after the revolution, when you have to figure out how do you put in place that bold imagination? How do you institutionalize the dreams that have been deferred?
At the very end of the Civil War, in March 1865, Congress established this unprecedented institution, the Freedmen's Bureau, or its full name, the Bureau of Freedmen, former slaves, refugees, that's what whites who were displaced by the war, and abandoned lands. This would be a federal agency to oversee the transition from slavery to freedom, to oversee labor contracts, to set up schools, to provide medical care, to try to suppress violence in the South, to set up their own court system, to distribute rations to hungry people, and to settle blacks on land. Remember, the title, Abandoned Land, is in that title. The federal government had come into possession of large amounts of land in the South, and there were those who thought the government should allow black people to get hold of some of that land. And the original Freedmen's Bureau bill seems to suggest this.
The masses of black people, the rural folk, wanted to have their own piece of land and be independent. And in that way, you can see there's so many grounds for common identity among the rural people of the South, white and black. Unfortunately, it was divided by racism. because most Southern whites believed that they were better off if African Americans were in a degraded position.
White Southerners wanted to try and replicate the economic and social conditions of slavery as much as possible.
Many people just couldn't quite even deal with it, that this was something the government had never done anything remotely like this. And by the end of 1865, new governments are in place in the South, and they pass laws which really indicate that they are unable to come to terms with the fact that black people are free. They pass what are called the Black Codes, which are a series of laws restricting the black population. In other words, it's trying to get them just back to work on the plantations as a dependent labor force with no political rights, no civil rights, nothing.
Take my bed and dream my dream.
Apologies for the some of that video was kind of choppy. I'll probably have to reload that. But there's these videos from our Facing Our History and Ourselves could teach this class, but I'd better continue here. Just Fonner, in his second founding, How the Civil War and Reconstruction Remade the Constitution, says the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were the most tangible legacies of America's attempt to build an egalitarian society on the ashes of the Civil War. Taken together, these three amendments usher in a second founding, as they enhance the powers of the federal government, create a new constitutional relationship between the individual and the state, and engraft the concept of equal protection of the laws and establish the right to vote. He poses throughout his book the Reconstruction questions as he frames them. Who is entitled to citizenship? Who should enjoy the right to vote? Should the laws protect the rights of aliens as well as citizens? How should the equal protection of the laws be defined and guaranteed? What should be the balance of power between the federal government and the states? How should Americans be protected from the predations of terrorists? These are the questions that Johnson and his conservative administration will address. These are the same questions that the radical Republicans will address in a very different manner when they assume power in the 39th Congress. And I would argue that these are questions we still wrestle with today in Fonner's characterization of this second founding. The 13th Amendment has, as you recall, a very, very short amendment: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. That exception language, we will quickly look. We don't need to wait for the 20th, 21st century to see how that's used in the era of mass incarceration, as Michelle Alexander described it. Almost immediately, once these Johnson Reconstruction governments or governors take control of the South, they will use that provision, use the Black Codes to begin the process of re-enslavement of freed men, women, and children. So these questions, from slavery to freedom, freedom meant different things to different people, which was one of the great challenges. Whether you're black or you're white, north or south, that definition just wasn't clear and wasn't provided by the 13th Amendment, as Fonner said. Whites assumed that blacks didn't know what freedom meant, which is a remarkable mindset considering the many years that blacks served as slaves and desired to be free and demonstrated that desire, again, through running away, through rebellion, through numerous forms of resistance. So we'll see that played out. The concept of building a black community, We see the Black church in this era become increasingly strong, will be the foundation from which all of the institutions, the small businesses, the fraternal organizations will spring. And it will become the center place of Black political activity in the era of radical Reconstruction, and we'll see it develop. The economics of freedom. Again, this issue of land, I said, I think in our first session, I'll continue to repeat throughout, was the quintessential desire of the freedmen. They recognized the importance of land. They recognized those who owned land, who would know better than the enslaved people, the importance of land to the enslaver, to the landowner. Here is a short passage from a formerly enslaved man. So 1866, after Army officials forced freedman Bailey Wyatt to vacate the Virginia land he had occupied since the end of the war, he argued at a public meeting for free people's right to the land as follows. We now as a people desires to be elevated, and we desires to do all we can to be educated and hope our friends will aid us all they can. I may state to all our friends and to all our enemies that we has a right to the land where we are located. For why? I tell you, our wives, our children, our husbands has been sold over and over again to purchase the lands we now locate upon. For that reason, we have a divine right to the land. And then didn't we clear the land and raise the crops of corn, of cotton, of tobacco, of rice, of sugar, of everything? And then didn't them large cities in the north grow up on the cotton and the sugars and the rice that we made? Yes. I appeal to the south and the north. If I hasn't spoken the words of truth, I say they have grown rich and my people poor. Perhaps the earliest, simplest, and clearest argument in favor of reparations. I think Ta-Nehisi Coates would have agreed, obviously, with everything that this gentleman argues in his piece. The origins of Black politics. We will see, and I think I've made the point that even before the 13th Amendment, certainly with the passage of the Emancipation, you see this growing energy on farms, in plantations, in cities, in the countryside, Black people meeting, talking about what's going on around them. This impression that the enslaver, that many white people had, that the Black folks couldn't read, therefore couldn't possibly know what's happening, is simply misguided. The record would prove far more formerly enslaved people could read than was known, and there were oral traditions of passing on information from those who could read. You remember the reference to Du Bois reading to the illiterate coal miners. Again, just one example of that reality. Violence in everyday life. When you consider the circumstance of the South, and we'll talk more about that, when you consider the return to the South of the defeated Confederates, armed with at least their sidearms, if not their rifles, and the clash, the inevitable clash that would come between these returning soldiers to a thoroughly hollowed out society because of the devastation of this war, now confronting these formerly enslaved men, women, and children, having the temerity to stand up and say, I'm free. I declare that I want to vote, that I want to own land, that I want to fully participate as a citizen. The violence was inevitable. And as we will see, it is unrelenting, even to today. So let me take a few minutes and talk about Lincoln's second inaugural address. There are passages from this that I know the slide, of course, perhaps displays the one that most comes to mind when we think of his inaugural address. I'm struck by phrases in the middle part of that speech that reveal, I think, Lincoln's thinking, again, his evolving thinking on slavery and the enslaved. Just a couple of passages. He says, these slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. The question of, was slavery the cause of the war or not? We could spend a lot of time, and in my slavery class we do, and I think those of us who read and think and look at the actual documents the seceded states filed in leaving, there's no question. Lincoln answers that question. He knew slavery was the cause of the war. He goes on to comment then on the anticipation of the North and the South in entering the war. He says, neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with, or even before the conflict itself ceased. Slavery, in his mind, again, wasn't the reason to go to war. He going into it probably never envisioned that he could end slavery, again, being the constitutionalist, having relied on the fact that the Constitution protected slavery, and again, his prime objective was to preserve the Union. But he's now at this point realizing I'm ending slavery as a result of these actions. Lastly, his comments on God and his views of this conflict and these 250 years of brutal enslavement. He says, it may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not that we be not judged. So he's indicating he knows that God can't smile favorably on the treatment of these people for these 250 years. Lincoln goes on to say the prayers of both could not be answered. North and South couldn't pray to the same God asking for different outcomes. And then finally, I think most powerfully, he says, fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. So Lincoln recognizing God's judgment on the sin of slavery and God's right to extract an eye for an eye if he chose. That's always struck me as a powerful part of the speech that I think is often missed. You saw this slide in the movie, and I put it here because it tells you really all you need to know about the Bureau of Freedmen, Refugees, and Abandoned Lands. This gentleman is a Union officer, Union Army officer, who's been tasked as a Freedmen's Bureau agent. Most of the Freedmen Bureau agents were officers. They were often alone and sent into hostile territory. The war is over, but on the left you see the fairly well-armed, angry, white, mostly former Confederate soldiers facing off against the far less well-armed freedmen. And in between stands this singular individual pleading for peace and accommodation, no apparent support from the War Department, but sent into really an incredibly difficult situation. I think this is again a powerful image that tells us what the Freedmen Bureau agents faced. Foner describes this issue again of land Freedmen and the Land. He says, the sole ambition of the freedmen at the present time appears to become the owner of a little piece of land, there to erect a humble home and to dwell in peace and security at his own free will and pleasure. If he wishes to cultivate the ground in cotton on his own account, to be able to do so without anyone to dictate to him hours or system of labor, if he wishes instead to plant corn or sweet potatoes, to be able to do that free from any outside control, that is their idea, their desire, and their hope. Fonner recognizing, again, as Chad Williams said in the clip, these freedmen simply wanted to own their own land and to own their own lives, not to be dictated to by the former enslavers. Du Bois has a marvelous section on the Freedmen Bureau. He goes into extraordinary detail in describing the work of these valiant men. We will see throughout the the redemption period and into the 20th century, the Freedmen's Bureau being characterized as maybe the worst example of abuse foisted upon the prostrate state, the South, by the North. And what Du Bois does is he breaks that argument down thoroughly to, as he describes the Freedmen's Bureau's task as 12 labors of Hercules faced the Freedmen's Bureau. He says they had to make a general survey of conditions and needs in every state and locality to relieve the immediate hunger and distress, to appoint state commissioners and upwards of 900 bureau officials to cover the 11 states of the former Confederacy, to put laborers to work at regular wage, to transport laborers, teachers, and officials, to furnish land for the peasants, to open schools, to pay bounties to black soldiers and their families, to establish hospitals and guard health, to administer justice between man and former master, to answer continuous and persistent criticism, North and South, black and white, to find funds to pay for all this. There was no budget. I'm amazed to think about that. The money came from the War Department. Congress created these agencies a year at a time, no budget, and sent these poorly resourced former Army officers who obviously would have much preferred to get back to their homes, to their lives, to their families, in an impossible situation. I won't read all of what Du Bois had to share. I'll try to include some of this, but he actually has the numbers. So the money that was spent on the various projects, the number of schools, the number of teachers, the number of hospitals, the number of doctors, the dollars that went into meals for black and white. Don't lose sight of the fact that poor white folks, as well as poor black folks, many freed, formerly enslaved people, were dying in the countryside and in the streets. And it was the Freedmen's Bureau who came, so to speak, to the, perhaps their most difficult challenge was in providing for some system of justice. Imagine all of the conflicts, all of the claims, all of the again, horrendous acts that were being committed upon the freedmen, and the Freedmen's Bureau agent was called on to intervene. One of the agents, Samuel Thompson, a Mississippi Bureau director in 1865, talked about protecting the freedmen from white terrorism. He defined the problem. He said the white public could not conceive of the Negro any rights at all. He said men who are honorable in their dealing with white neighbors will cheat a Negro without feeling a single twinge of their honor. To kill a Negro, they do not deem murder. To debauch a Negro woman, they do not think fornication. To take property away from a Negro, they do not deem robbery. They still have the ingrained feelings that the black people at large belong to the whites at large. So this is the tension, and we'll see one of the criticisms of the agents and the agency was really to fully grasp the depth of the anti-black feeling that would continue to grow and grow in the South over this era. The O.O. Howard, a Union Army general, is put in charge of the Bureau and is overseeing this 900 agents and is doing what can be done until Johnson will take over and completely change the program. He will cut and ultimately destroy the Freedmen's Bureau and will give Howard and his Bureau agents the responsibility to go on to these 40-acre plots and remove the formerly freed people and force them back onto the plantations. There's a letter that O.O. Howard will receive from one of the freedmen. He says, "General, we want homesteads. We were promised homesteads by the government. If it does not carry out the promises its agents made to us, if the government, having concluded to befriend its late enemies and to neglect to observe the principles of common faith between itself and us, its allies, in the war you said was over, now takes away from them all rights to the soil they stand upon, save such as they can get by again working for your late and all-time enemies. We are left in a more unpleasant condition than our former. You will see this is not the condition of really free men." So he's juxtaposing the North's position, which effectively will support the rebels, against the freedmen, many of whom had fought in the U.S. colored troops once they're now being deposed from the land. So we'll talk more about Johnson here in a bit as we get into more about presidential reconstruction. How do these agents, how does the federal government establish a free labor economy in the South devastated by war, in a region who had always operated, indeed had prospered on slave labor? That's the great challenge. Professor Waugh in the video clip talked about the commonality of interest between poor white, poor black farmers that should have created alignments to help build that economy, but white supremacy and the poor white farmers' belief that things may be bad, but at least I'm not black. At least I'm not a former slave. That would prevent that alliance from happening, and the planters would use that rift and build on that rift until we get into, again, the redemption period and the utter disruption of the potential for a true free labor economy. This question of labor contracts, the freedmen want autonomy, they want land, they're going to lose their right to that land, but they do not want to be forced to work for their former enslavers. And you'll see in these black codes that we're going to examine, that's precisely the plan. The planters and these new governors and their new governments will impose upon freedmen the obligation to sign annual labor contracts. And if they refuse, they will be jailed and therefore unable to pay the fines imposed by that jail sentence, will then be contracted back out to the former enslaver, thus the beginning of contract leasing. Okay, let me stop. I've been running on here for too long. Marian, do we have any questions as we head toward the third and last part of our session?
Yes, we have some comments and some questions. One is from Dana Cunningham. She states that this is after Lincoln signed the Homestead Act in 1862 that allowed settlers to claim lots of up to 160 acres if they lived on the land and improved it. Why weren't the formerly enslaved included in this free land rush?
Racism, Dana, racism. And that's a quick answer, but the fact is, they were not, and that is perhaps the earliest example of the kind of economic inequality that we will see more powerfully when you get into the 20th century. And I quickly use the example of the federal home loan, the GI Bill, all of these Great Society, or I'm sorry, New Deal programs will exclude Black people in a variety of ways. But this Homestead Act that you point to is the earliest example of how whites benefited from a government policy that discriminated against Blacks, gave whites the advantage to build wealth through farming. Some of these farms obviously are going to go on to become enterprises, and the wealth will be passed through generations. And so again, that's the quick answer. We could go through, again, too many examples of this kind of policy-based discrimination that created the inequality that we continue to wrestle with today.
And Sandy Armstrong asks, could you explain what happened with contract labor again?
I hit that very, very quickly. Thank you. So the country needed the South to get back to work. They needed those plantations up and running. Remember, before the war, the wealthiest people in the world, not just in America, lived in the South. The 10 wealthiest people in the world lived in and around Natchez, Mississippi. Cotton was the most valuable commodity in the world. And the country's economy needed that to be the case going forward. So they needed Black folks to get back to work, and that meant back on the plantation. The easiest way for them to do that was to force freedmen to sign annual labor contracts. Freedmen obviously didn't want to do that. They wanted their own land. They wanted to manage their own lives. They certainly didn't want to sign contracts with their former enslavers who had been returned to the plantation, right? So the freedmen had occupied the land. They'd been thrown off the land. The enslavers, the planters were back on the land, and the governments in the South, again, these are the Johnson governments, were requiring that freedmen sign labor contracts that bound them for at least a year, and they'd have to renew that every year. And if they did not have a signed contract and they were stopped, as we'll see, these are part of the Black codes, they could be stopped by any white person and forced to show their contract. If they didn't have a contract, they were determined to be vagrant. And that vagrancy led then to a jail sentence, to fines, and of course they had no money to pay the fines, so the sheriff would lend them out, lease them out. They'd end up in the same place. And so this tension over labor contracts would be a ongoing battle throughout, long beyond Reconstruction, but this is where it begins. It was slavery by another name.
Hey, comment regarding labor contracts. Not a question, and this is from Stephen Hoffman. Just an observation. These labor contracts are even worse than I had imagined.
Yes, and for the reason I've just said. I mean, imagine the freedmen, the disappointment, the horror at having been placed on land and then being dispossessed and forced back to the plantation, often for the enslaver they had escaped after the emancipation or after the end of the war.
And another observation from Dana Cunningham. when we're talking about the land that was stolen from Native Americans originally.
Exactly. Where did that land actually come from? Yeah, very
And,
good.
Linda Krupp has a question, another question if we have time. Is it true that unemployment insurance had an exemption for agricultural workers to prevent many Blacks from claiming that benefit?
Yeah, that's exactly right. She used the term unemployment insurance, Social Security, I'm sorry, as an example. Again, part of the Great Society, domestic workers and agricultural workers were not included. And who made up the lion's share of domestic workers and agricultural workers? Poor Black folks. So yes, that's exactly right.
Those are all the comments, questions.
All right. Thank you, Marion. Let's take a look at, I really want to get into this Johnson presidential Reconstruction era, and hopefully this video will play better than the other. But it, again, does an excellent job of framing the debates to come in between Johnson and the radical Republicans.
Reconstruction in many ways was a continuation of the Civil War itself, and the fields of battle shift from the battlefields in the South to the halls of Congress.
Who is going to rule the federal government now and determine this policy of Reconstruction, of how the Union would be put back together? And by that I mean, would it be the president, the executive branch, or would it be Congress? Those two sides had fundamentally different visions of what Reconstruction would be. And it has a lot to do with this problem, this vast problem of how do you begin to heal from such an all-out terrible war? How do you get healing? But then also, how do you balance all that necessary healing with questions of justice?
Could you have racial justice along with healing, binding the wounds of the war? Right? Could you bring North and South together? Could you bring white Northerners and white Southerners together? If you had African Americans and their hopes and aspirations at the center of what the nation could be. And those two ideals ran against one another and spoke to just why Reconstruction was so contentious, why it was so highly fraught.
If you really want to understand the dynamic as it unfolded after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, you have to come to terms with the presidency of Andrew Johnson.
Johnson was not a Republican, he was a Democrat. He was a strong unionist. He was from Tennessee. He had opposed the secession of Tennessee. He was the one senator from a seceding state who remained in the Senate. Lincoln later appointed him military governor of Tennessee. And he was put on the ticket in 1864 to show Republicans sort of respect for the white pro-union people in the South, and as a way of looking forward to these are the people the Republican Party is going to appeal to in the South once the war is over, because before the Civil War, the Republicans didn't even exist in the South. Now they want to move into the South as a party appealing to people like Andrew Johnson.
He was added to the ticket in that way that vice presidents are often added to the ticket, not even thinking that anything terrible could happen to the president. Well, when it did, the Northern people woke up the day after Lincoln died, not only soaking in the tragedy and the horror of this act of assassination, but also realizing that their president was a former slave holder from Tennessee who was really a Democrat and not a Republican.
Johnson was also a virulent white supremacist. It was necessary to end slavery and all of the power that slavery brought, especially to the planter class of the South. And Andrew Johnson grew up working class. He grew up poor, and he had nothing but contempt for the great planter class of the South. But he also was a staunch states' rightist. He did not want the powers of the federal government expanded at all.
What Johnson is hoping he can do is pick up the Democrats in the North, because the Democrats are a viable group in a number of states. If he can pick them up and knit them together with the Democrats in the South, he's got this pre-Civil War coalition back together.
Well, many people, millions, especially on the losing side in the South, but many whites in the North too, wanted some version of an aftermath of the Civil War that was supposed to be the Union as it was, but the Constitution as it is. In other words, restore the Union. Fought an all-out war to save the Union. But don't alter the Constitution. Don't change who has the right to vote, and who has civil rights, and who has civil liberties. Others, of course, many, many Northern Republicans, and certainly most blacks, were saying, no, no, no. The Union as it was, but a whole new Constitution is necessary.
The Republicans in Congress have a dilemma. First of all, they're not in session when Lincoln is assassinated. They expect that Johnson's going to call them back into session, which a president can do. And Johnson says, no thanks, guys, I got this. And I'm going to take care of this myself, because he's trying to put together a world that looks very much like before the war, before the Republicans got their hands on the governments, before they expanded it to help everybody. So the Republicans can't really do anything. They have no power until Johnson calls them back into session, or until their session starts.
Presidential Reconstruction begins with Johnson in May 1865 issuing a series of orders appointing new governors for most of the southern states and setting out requirements for these states to get back into the Union. And the requirements he set out are minimal. They have to ratify the 13th Amendment, that is, acknowledge the end of slavery. They have to repudiate secession. And then later he goes on, they have to repudiate the Confederate debt. They can't pay off people who had loaned money to the Confederacy. And that's it. Nothing in there about the rights of black people at all.
And they do as he asked, but they also pass the Black Codes, which are an attempt to put African Americans back into, at the very least, serfdom, but there are pieces of all those laws that essentially reestablish slavery.
He had tried to keep the old planter class out of power by saying anyone who owned more than $20,000 before the Civil War in property would have to get a special pardon from him to take part in politics. So he's trying to keep them up to the side. But no, it didn't work out that way.
By the end of the summer of 1865, he has pardoned all but about 1,500 Southern Confederates, which is astonishing if you think about it. This is a war that took over 600,000 lives, over $2.5 billion. And only a matter of months after it, the same men who started the war are in charge of bringing the South back in.
Some people were returned to Congress in December 1865, less than a year after Appomattox, even donning their Confederate uniforms.
Alexander H. Stevens from Georgia had been vice president of the Confederacy, was elected to Congress from Georgia.
As soon as Congress gets back into session, Johnson addresses them and he says, Reconstruction's over. I took care of it while you guys were out. He doesn't call it Reconstruction, actually. He calls it restoration. He has restored the South to the Union. And he says it needed to be done quickly. If we had left the military in the South, it would have made Southerners unhappy. So right there, he's defining Southerners as white people. It would have made Southerners unhappy, and it would have been far too expensive. Now, all you guys have to do is you have to seat the senators and congressmen who are here in Washington waiting to be seated.
And the Republicans in Congress threw up a wall, threw up the halt sign, said, stop, no, 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 no. This isn't going to happen. Their vision of Reconstruction was that it should be much longer, much harsher, and run by Congress. The Republican majority in Congress says, no, these guys are not yet ready to serve, and so it's pretty much a northern Congress. The Republican Party has a significant majority, but the Republican Party is divided among itself. There are the mainstream, moderate Republicans are the majority, and basically they feel Johnson's made a lot of mistakes, but we got to work with him. He's set up these governments, they're functioning. We've got to sort of work with Johnson to make this situation better, to protect the rights of the blacks a little better, and try to keep these Confederates out. But basically, let's take Johnson's system that he's put in place and just improve it. Then there were the radical Republicans, people like Thaddeus Stevens from Pennsylvania in the House, Charles Sumner from Massachusetts in the Senate. They basically say, forget it. Johnson's plan is terrible. We've got to get rid of it. And very quickly, what they want is black suffrage, black male suffrage. Nobody, unfortunately, is talking about women voting at this time. But most Republicans are not willing to go for black suffrage at this time. You know, only 5 northern states allow black men to vote at this point. Most northerners did not want blacks voting. And so a lot of Republicans say, this is dangerous politically. We're not going to get very far with this. So the moderates come forward with their own plan, which is, as I say, let us make Johnson's policy better. And the way to do that is to pass a law, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, to guarantee the basic rights of the former slaves. It recognizes Johnson's governments, they're there, but they've been so discriminatory. Now we're going to have the federal government overrule them and by federal law give black people the same civil rights, not the right to vote, go to court, own property, sue and be sued, have the same basic rights within the legal justice system as white people. Johnson could have signed it and saved himself a lot of trouble, but he vetoes the law. He says, no, my plan is perfect. I don't want this. And moreover, I don't think blacks should have the same rights as white people. Nothing in our history suggests they should. The law discriminates against whites. It's giving all this help to blacks and not to whites. And he vetoes it, and Congress passes it over his veto. The first major law in American history passed over the veto of the president. And that really is the split between Johnson and Congress, and it leaves the moderates kind of bereft in that what are they going to do now? They wanted to work with Johnson, but Johnson doesn't want to work with them, is basically the problem.
When Andrew Johnson was so obstinate to their plans for Reconstruction, he converted, frankly, a lot of white Northerners over to the Republicans' cause. Because, let's face it was only a year after the war, a year and a half, even 2 years. And millions of Northerners had just fought this bloody war, and they'd lost their brothers and their sons. And Andrew Johnson is going to let all the Southern states back in the Union and say, it's over, get over it, let's all be nice again, reunion, reunion. Northerners were not ready for that.
But that gives them a dilemma. If they're not going to reconstruct the government based on the way Johnson wants to do it, what are they going to do? Well, the first thing they do, as Congress always does, they make a committee. They're getting petitions from everybody. They're discussing stuff all the time. There's lots of testimony. There's many things going on. When they finally come out with a proposal, it's the 14th Amendment.
It still doesn't give black men the right to vote, but it puts the principle of birthright citizenship and equality among citizens into the Constitution. That 14th Amendment is going to enshrine that phrase that we all have this right to equal protection of the law. Now that has a million different possible interpretations. But everyone now gets to at least have a piece of that, supposedly. Gets to identify somehow with a nation state which is going to guarantee everybody some kind of equality before law. That's a revolution. Johnson opposes it. Johnson tells the southern states not to ratify it. In the fall of 1866, there's an election, congressional elections, and the Republicans win even greater power. People supporting Johnson's policies are defeated in the North. And basically, by this point, more and more Republicans are saying, these radicals have a point here. And now, by the end of 1866, beginning of 1867, the radicals say, okay, you see, here's our point. You cannot work with Johnson. The governments he set up are no good. The only way out is black suffrage. We've got to create new governments in the South with black and white. In other words, democracy, to put it in a simple way. Let men vote, black and white, and then we'll have real democratic government in the South. And that's what Congress does in March 1867. They pass the Reconstruction Acts, which basically throw out the Johnson governments and create a situation for the election of new constitutional conventions in the South to create new governments in the South, new elections in the South, the first experiment in interracial democracy in American history. That is the radical triumph in early 1867.
So I've got 30 or 40 minutes of material in the next 5, so this will be quick. But I wanted to read a passage from Bonner, and it's too long, but it's just wonderful describing Johnson's character. This is a quote from someone who knew him, a short passage. Andrew Johnson was the queerest character that ever occupied the White House, one contemporary remarked. And it seems safe to predict that his career as president will always remain something of an enigma. That's the ending piece on that. But I think the historians in the video properly characterized Johnson for you. His racism was, as everyone had said, was evident in his December 1867 annual address to Congress. Johnson insisted that blacks possessed less capacity for government than any other race of people. This is his address to the Congress. He says, no independent government of any form has ever been successful in their hands. On the contrary, wherever they have been left to their own devices, they have shown a constant tendency to relapse into barbarism. He goes on, it gets worse, and I'm not going to read more, but is why, to a large degree, in my view, Reconstruction failed. It got off to such a poor start under such utterly inept leadership. So Johnson's plan was with these pardons, and you know, started out early. You remember he had this encounter with a group of black Tennesseans, and he said, I'm going to really put it to these planters who have harmed the South so terribly. Of course, his plan was to require the wealthiest of these planters to meet with him personally. He would end up pardoning everybody. And he would put in place governors, as he said, like Alexander Stephens, the former vice president of the Confederacy, would be returned to the Senate. Well, the governors were no better. The Florida governor, a gentleman by the name of Marvin, once Johnson puts him in place, he says to his black constituents, blacks must not delude themselves into believing that their fate had been central to the Civil War or that emancipation implied civil equality or the vote. He advised freedmen to return to the plantations, labor diligently, and call your old master, master. So these are the new governments that Johnson enforces or imposes on the South, and it's why the radical Republicans will overturn all of that and take control in their era. Okay, let's see. The Black Codes. So Southern states are now back in control for a short period of time through the end of Johnson's term before 1868. These Black Codes, I just wanted to give you a sense of, and this is the Mississippi Black Code of 18, or of course they knew there were Black Codes, 1865, just as a couple of bullet points. Section 3, it shall not be lawful for any freedman, free Negro, or mulatto to intermarry with any white person. Any person who shall so intermarry shall be deemed guilty of a felony, and on conviction thereof be confined in the state penitentiary for life. Section 5, every freedman, free Negro, mulatto shall, on the second Monday of January 1866, annually have a lawful home or employment and shall provide written evidence thereof. Again, so back to this concept of blacks having to produce evidence of their employment, of their residence, or be determined vagrants. Section 6, all contracts for labor made with freedmen, free Negroes, and mulattoes for a longer period than 1 month shall be in writing. If the laborer shall quit the service of the employer before the expiration of his term, without good cause, he shall forfeit his wages for that year up to the time of quitting. And then section 7, most importantly, every civil officer shall and every person may arrest and carry back to his or her legal employer any freedman, freed Negro, or mulatto who shall have quit the service. So this is this concept of white control, both official and unofficial, white control over black bodies. It begins here, and I'm sad to say it is still the reality today we saw with George Floyd. Okay. So Johnson would prove to be a utter disappointment, obviously, to the Republicans. They had hoped that they could work with him, but obviously his veto of their 1866 Civil Rights Act, the 14th Amendment, we'll look at all of that next week. The moderates the moderate Republicans thought they could work with Johnson, and they realized that they could not. The radical Republicans saw the Civil War as a golden moment. This is a chance to reform this nation. Thaddeus Stevens again, and Charles Sumner being their principal leaders. They were enthusiastic and they were hopeful. They were looking for evidence that the South was changed, that this terrible conflict would have changed possibly minds and hearts, and there would be the opportunity. But they soon realized the fallacy in that thinking when reports of the Black Codes and white violence was brought to their attention. As we've seen, as is clear, Johnson was unwilling to compromise, and that would doom any efforts to work with him and would ultimately lead to the radical Republicans placing military governments in the South in 5 districts to run those governments through the end of Reconstruction. So next week, we're going to look at this radical Reconstruction and these questions. Who's going to rule the South? How would Southern states be readmitted, different than Johnson's plans? What rights would former enslavers enjoy? And who should enforce those rights, the federal governments, or should they look to the states? So that concludes our lecture for today. And we've got some questions, Marion, I'm told.
Yes, we do. One or two. One question from Dr. Ebony Wilkins is, what's serfdom?
Serfdom is a form of slavery. I think the term is more often associated with European labor systems. I think of the Russian serfs, but it again it is I think a synonym. Doesn't necessarily properly describe chattel slavery in America, because serfs maybe would be more as indentured servants, but serfs could find their way out of serfdom to some different status. Chattel slaves in America, as we know, were slaves for life. Their children would be slaves for life, and that only ended with the passage of the 13th Amendment. So a form of slavery, but different.
Okay. A comment from James Stewart. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was used in a 1968 Supreme Court case to decide for a plaintiff who was denied a property purchase because he was Black.
Absolutely, absolutely astute as always, Mr. President. And who knew? We know of the modern day civil rights acts, the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Civil Rights Act of 1965. We're talking about 1860s. It's really remarkable, and great foresight on the part of the Republican Congress at the time, and vetoed, as we know, by President Johnson, Andrew Johnson.
There are a couple of comments comparing Johnson to the present person who is in the White House.
Are they able to be shared, or is it language we wouldn't use in public?
No, just comparison, that they're very similar in their way of thinking, and that's.
So Johnson may not be the queerest man ever to occupy the office. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's what they're saying. Okay. Felix and Nancy McElroy, the institutional walls and systemic structures of post-emancipation were built on the foundation of white supremacy. This explains why it has been so difficult to achieve real societal changes and equality.
Agreed. And I think thank you for the comment. The sorrow that Du Bois expressed in his work, certainly in Black Reconstruction, but in all of his sociological and historic and economic analysis, is the sorrow that our system was never able to create that alliance between poor white folks and poor Black folks. He recognized, and many other thinkers recognized, that therein lay the greatest opportunity to overcome the racism of the history and to build a new world, a new economy. But white supremacy and that the wages of whiteness, as David Roediger would say, or the psychological wage that Du Bois referred to, was simply too powerful and too attractive to poor whites who saw themselves better than poor Blacks.
A couple, David, did you want to stop sharing your screen now?
Yes. Thank you, Marion.
Okay, Linda pointed out.
Excellent.
And a couple of definitions, additional definitions of servitude. One, debt bondage and indentured servitude, or what serfdom is. And then debt peonage is a term that is used to describe how Blacks were kept tied to the land.
Yes.
Okay.
Very good.
And another one, was this considered indentured servitude? It sounds worse.
was what considered indentured services?
I am going to assume the statement regarding debt peonage. If we wanted to take off mute, then people could just have comments.
Yeah, why don't we stop? We stopped our recording, right, Marion? We don't need to record. I'd like to have some more